the crisis in Ukraine, and the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken is to meet the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov next week, as the US Secretary of State warned that the crisis in Ukraine was a moment of peril for the lives and safety of millions of people. This comes as yesterday US President Joe Biden expressed his concern that invasion of Ukraine was likely to occur in the next several days. Meanwhile, Prime Minister Boris Johnson described an attack on a kindergarten in eastern Ukraine as a false flag operation designed to discredit the Ukrainians. Well, let's talk through all of this now with senior lecturer at the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst, Andrew Fox. Welcome to the programme, Andrew. We're seeing a lot of mixed signals right now. The Russians at the start of the week saying they were withdrawing, the West unable to verify that. Indeed, some reports that actually Russian forces are still building up to greater numbers on the borders of Ukraine. Who do we believe?
Well, I think you can take it as read that you can't believe the Russians at this point. Their entire game plan is based around information warfare. So we're talking about propaganda in old school money. And really, we've got to rely on what our own security services and intelligence services are saying, because that's what we base all our plans on. And we know the other side is deliberately trying to mislead us. So I think, in terms of the stuff that our side is pushing out, I think that's probably the way forward, and we should listen to them.
And of course, our Foreign Secretary was warning about this false flag operation, perhaps a pretext for invasion. We've seen this before, where one side will feign an attack and say, well, we need to retaliate or we need to defend as the pretext for going in to that country. How likely would you say that we are to experience something like that?
I mean, there's a pattern to the way the Russians do things, and there's a sort of an escalation pathway that they go down. So they start with understanding the dynamics on the ground. So they look at the areas in Ukraine that are weak, so the Donbass and Crimea. They apply economic pressure. They will try and corrupt civil society and stoke social divisions. And then they'll move up to military posturing and issuing diplomatic demands, and that's what we've seen so far. But I think the next step for the Russians in the way they normally do things will be sabotage of services. And we've seen cyber attacks in the last sort of 48 hours, false flag attacks, and activating agents within Ukraine to stoke up, social unrest. And it's only after they've sort of achieved all those things that they're likely to then attempt direct action. Now, I don't think they're going to try a full land invasion to occupy the entire country. In terms of the troop numbers they've got on the border, they just don't have enough people positioned to actually control the whole country. But what we can expect to see if things do escalate is continued artillery fire and attacks of that nature, potential raids, soldiers going over the border in unmarked uniforms as they did in 2014, so almost mercenaries. And then that could be a prelude to a full-scale raid using their armoured forces that are positioned on the border at the moment.
And what's Mr. Putin trying to get out of this? Is he trying to annex further bits of Ukraine? Is he trying to annex the whole of the Donbass region? Or is he just trying to present himself as a global player, as someone who is one of the most important men in the world, after Russia might have felt a bit sidelined with all the speak about China in the last few years?
And I think it's both of those things, actually. I think Russia have had a very clear strategy over the last 20 years to try and make themselves have USSR levels of influence on the world stage. And they've done that quite successfully. Quite a lot of the things that Putin does end up on the front pages of the papers and make Russia look powerful. And so that's a big win for him. In terms of Ukraine, it's always been a weakness for Russia. I mean, if you look at the invasions Russians have suffered in its history, through Napoleon or through Hitler's Germany, you can see that the Ukraine is a traditional weak point. There's a big Urals mountain, and then there's a big flat plain in Ukraine that essentially points like a dagger at the heart of Moscow. And so they've always been particularly sensitive to Ukraine, and what they want is a Ukraine that is eastern facing rather than western facing. And so EU moves to draw Ukraine closer to the West, as well as, the concerns that Russia has over NATO expansion. Putin would like to see those knocked on the head and have Ukraine as a Russian satellite state rather than a Western ally.
Now, I can understand the sort of historical idea that Putin would want Ukraine within his orbit, that sort of old-fashioned term, the sphere of influence. But does anyone in Moscow really believe that there might be invasion of Russia in the future, that they need to control this area because people might invade? Do they genuinely think that NATO is anything other than a defensive alliance?
There's certainly a paranoia on the Russian side. If you look at the way they've developed their military over the last 10 years, they're actually focusing on defensive capability against NATO strengths. So they've focused on close shore naval defences, anti-aircraft, missile systems to negate NATO's air power advantage. And so there is definitely a sort of strategic paranoia in Moscow on that one. Do they actually think they're going to be invaded? No. But they do want that sphere of influence, as you say, to be expanded as much as possible. And NATO's presence in the Baltics and in Eastern Europe presents a threat to that. So they see it as a threat to Russian influence on the world stage. And that's very much something they want to propagate, and they're going to keep pushing for.
And I suppose just finally in this conversation, is Mr. Putin winning? He doesn't necessarily have to take over any more of Ukraine in order to win, but just keeping Ukraine out of NATO could be a big diplomatic win there. Has the West been playing his game by sending all of these foreign secretaries, defense secretaries, prime ministers and presidents and chancellors to Moscow to sort of cower before him and say, what can we do to stop this? Is Mr. Putin winning?
I mean, it's very hard to say how you express a win or a loss on the diplomatic stage. I do think he's played a very clever hand so far. He's seen where the weaknesses lie in Ukrainian society, and he's exploited those. He's seen where the weaknesses are within the Western alliance. So he's used the gas supply to Germany to leverage cracks within NATO. And you can see the Germans not allowing flights over their airspace to resupply the Ukrainians. So he has certainly had success in terms of achieving his strategic goals. And I think that counts as a win. Where he turns it into a loss is if he oversteps. I think if he goes for a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, he's very likely to face sanctions. There'll be Russian casualties, and in a worst-case scenario, he'll be bogged down in urban warfare and counterinsurgency, which is the one thing he really doesn't want. So he's treading a fine line at the moment, but I would say strategically he is having success and meeting some of his goals, and he's on the front page of every paper in the world, and Russia look powerful. So he's in a fairly good place, and he's got the initiative at the moment, I'd suggest.
A concerning situation indeed. Well, Andrew Fox, Senior Lecturer at the Royal Military Academy, Sandhurst, thank you for joining us this afternoon on The Briefing.
Thank you.
Really interesting discussion.